Welcome and thank you for joining us today. To maintain focus on our speakers, all participants' mics and videos have been turned off. Closed captioning services will be provided for the webinar in English and Hebrew. Instructions on how to access these will be posted in the chat box. We have reserved some time at the end of the program for question and answer from the audience. If you're joining us from a computer, there is a Q&A option at the bottom of the Zoom program where you can type in your questions at any time. Please note today's call will be recorded. At this time, I'm going to turn over the call to Robert Trustin, ADL New England's Regional Director, to introduce the program and our guest speakers.
Thank you, Nora, for opening today's program. One of the great things about today's program is this is morning, afternoon, and evening for various people on the call. This is a first because we're spanning 10 separate time zones as we engage in this really, really important discussion about global anti-Semitism and extremism. Recently, anti-Semitic incidents have been occurring with growing frequency, and I think that's probably something that all of our experts have recognized. In the month of May alone, ADL recorded a 115% increase in anti-Semitic incidents when compared to May of 2020. In 2017, we also saw a large uptick in anti-Semitic incidents. And in the years since then, the number of anti-Semitic incidents has remained constant. In fact, when you consider the spectrum, and we've been tracking anti-Semitic incidents since the 1970s, the highest years on record were 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. And of equal concern, the number of violent incidents is increased in each of those years. This has culminated in feelings of insecurity, particularly amongst Jews in the United States. 63% of American Jews feel their communities are less safe than they were a decade ago. And I'm speaking from Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm sure we'll get into some discussion here about some of the more recent violent incidents that have actually occurred in our own community here in the Boston area. Our experience in America is part of a larger international trend. Global anti-Semitism is on the rise. According to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he said the old anti-Semitism is back and getting worse. Those are his words. And he also recently noted that anti-Semitism has become more prominent during the COVID-19 pandemic. These facts are reflected in the growing concern of American Jews. A recent ADL survey found that 77% of American Jews are more concerned now about anti-Semitism in America, and 75% are more concerned about anti-Semitism abroad. So we're a very small percentage of the global population and of the population in the United States, yet many, many, many people within our community are concerned about anti-Semitism and are concerned about their own safety and that of their families. The rise in anti-Semitism affects Israelis as well. And this sparks a variety of questions. What explains some of these trends? Why is anti-Semitism more prevalent now, both in the United States and abroad? And are there differences in the way Israelis and Americans view the recent spike in anti-Semitism? How might Americans and Israelis respond to these trends? So our hope with respect to today's program is to, we may not have all the answers, but we're going to dig into the discussion, and hopefully we're going to have some insights, maybe some answers from some of our panelists. But in order to move forward and understand the situation, I'm going to give a warm welcome to the panelists. I will do a quick introduction, and then we're going to jump right into some questions and discussion. And then just pay attention, as Nora mentioned, we're going to have time at the end reserved for questions from everyone who's participating in multiple countries. So Shira Rudderman is the Executive Director of the Rudderman Family Foundation an organization which works to advocate for the inclusion of people with disabilities throughout society, strengthen the relationship between Israel and the American Jewish community, and model best practices for strategic philanthropy. She served as the chairwoman of the Fulbright Foundation and Kesher, co-chair of the Opportunity Fund, president consul of Mass General, and the board member of the Jewish Funders Network, the Anti-Defamation League, and the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. In 2016, she and her husband Jay were chosen as a pair in Jerusalem Post's 50 most influential Jews in the world. Shira is a thought leader and a great partner in the collective work to combat anti-Semitism. And I'll say that Shira is also a personal friend and a sort of personal professional partner and friend to the work of the Anti-Defamation League, both here in the Boston area in particular, because we're both from this area, but globally as well. Erik וורד is a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements, hate violence, and preserving inclusive democracy. He currently serves as the executive director of the Western States Center and a senior fellow at both the Southern Poverty Law Center and Race Forward. He's also the co-chair of the Proteus Fund and a recipient of the Peabody Facebook Futures Media Award. Over the course of his more than 30-year career in civil rights, he has worked with countless organizations, has been quoted in countless world publications such as the New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post, and BBC, and he's authored numerous written works, including Skin in the Game, How Anti-Semitism Animates White Nationalism. And I know that in the COVID era, there have been thousands of people who have been exposed to Erik's insights and expertise. We've actually done a couple of programs together over the last 18 months. So welcome, Erik. Thanks for being with us. The morning for you, afternoon for me, and evening for others. And lastly, my longtime colleague, Oren Siegel, who is the vice president of ADL's Center on Extremism, which monitors, exposes, and disrupts extremist efforts both online and on the ground. Oren is in many ways now a global expert on the activities and tactics of a broad array of extremist groups. He is not just an internal expert and resource. You may have seen him on CNN and a lot of other publications. He is in many ways become a voice that translates extremist movements for members of the public, taking the movement ideologies and providing a real understanding so that people in communities who may be exposed, who may be impacted, have a better understanding of what these movements are and extremist activity. So welcome everyone. I'm going to start with Shira, really for the first question. And Shira, I'm hoping that maybe you can provide a little bit of perspective on like what's the reaction of Israelis to some of the most recent incidents in the United States, particularly during the conflict between Israel and Gaza. The United States has not always seen some of what Europe has sometimes experienced. But in the last 8 weeks, we saw and we continue to see violent attacks in New York City, in Brooklyn. We had diners in Los Angeles attacked when they were out on a sidewalk eating sushi. And, I think we'll probably get into some of the more recent ones that have occurred here in the Boston area.
First, I will say, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's an absolute pleasure and honor to be with you here today. I think what you are asking about, it's a very interesting question because there are two aspects of the answer. One, how Israelis in Israel perceive and understand anti-Semitism and how they react to what's going on globally in the world for Jews and more particularly in the United States. And on that aspect, I can say we need to do a better job. I think Israelis are full of empathy and want to be supportive of American Jewry, but they're not aware enough. They don't know enough. They don't understand where it's coming from. They don't understand its potential, and sometimes not the impact that it has on a person, on the daily activities, and what does it mean. At times we find the reaction is, okay, this is the price for Jews living outside of Israel, or this is terrible, but it's not our business. And I think part of this conversation today, the partnership, is to make it everyone's issue. Anti-Semitism is not just against Jews around United States, is a Jewish matter, meaning Israelis should care and be active. And I would even add a layer to say, this is an issue that it's a world issue, because if you allow yourself to be anti-Semitic, you will allow yourself to be racist and against minorities and other issues. So it's everyone's problem, and we should not be silent. The second aspect of what you said is the recent events, I think, in the United States. For me, I can tell you as a professional, as a mother of 4 kids, it's a wake-up call and a reminder of something I never forgot or took for granted, is that it doesn't matter where you live, how great the country is and how flourishing the democracy that we all part of is, and how successful our communities are. You know, under the surface, we experienced for many years, United States used to be a place that was, you know, anti-Semitic in its racist system, not the people. Jews were not accepted until, you know, the 70s to many, many, many places. And somehow we forgot this because we had very good 20, 30 years in the recent years. And we allow ourselves to say, okay, swastikal or BDS legislation in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or incident in a school in LA, it's local. And I think this conversation is to make it clear, it's not local. And if it happens in Cambridge and in Newton and in Brighton, it can happen in any place in the United States. And bring it all together, making it everyone's issue, make it relevant, not out of fear, out of knowledge and strength that the values of our democracies in Israel and in the United States should be better, can be better, and we all want and believe in it to be a society that does not tolerate not racism and not anti-Semitism against any groups or minorities.
Some really good points, Shira, and it's also a nice, it's an important reminder that, you know, in the United States, there's a long history of discrimination, you know, not just racism against people of color, but many, many institutions. You mentioned Cambridge, you know, there, you know, Harvard, amongst other well-known, world-renowned universities had quotas with respect to Jews, and many public hotels at one time or another did not allow people of color or Jews to stay overnight. So some important reminders there, and also the we're all connected, and I think discrimination, whether you're talking about Jews or other groups, the people that like to target us don't recognize the borders, and so I think that's an important point. Thank you, Eric. A few years ago, you observed that American Jews did not recognize that anti-Semitism was an issue in the United States, and as a result, didn't speak up, or were a little bit less vocal. And things seem to be changing now. We see the numbers, but I think we're starting to see voices changing. Can you give us a sense of like what you've observed in terms of like this kind of shift, and what might be behind it?
Absolutely. And it's a pleasure to be here and be part of this conversation today. So thank you for inviting me. I think we have to start with understanding a period that is actually hard to comprehend right now. And it is a period that predates Charlottesville, that predates the January 6th insurrection, right? Predates the myths and hoax around COVID or critical race theory, right? All hoaxes that are being spread that have underlying anti-Semitic conspiratorial groundings to them. It is a period in the United States, right, where for the most part, right, anti-Semitism is largely seen within the American public, not just the American Jewish community, right? But within the American public as something that takes place outside the United States, in Middle Eastern, North African countries, and in Europe, in South America, in Asia. In fact, many leading thinkers around anti-Semitism in the United States might have actually thought that anti-Semitism was on the decline and that Jews were actually being welcomed into the mainstream of American society. That is how the majority of America thought previous to Charlottesville. A little bit before that, I had authored an essay called Skin in the Game, how anti-Semitism animates white nationalism. Western State Center, the organization I'm the executive director of, had long been concerned about the rise of a social movement in this country that advocated ethnic cleansing, the creation of a white-only ethno-state. And the genesis of its worldview was anti-Semitism. In short, the argument when I wrote Skin in the Game was both a message to the Jewish community that anti-Semitism as a racialized form of anti-Jewish hatred, right? Not a religious form of bigotry, but a racialized form of bigotry was beginning to take root. My second argument was a larger argument to the left, racial justice and human rights organizations here in the United States as well. And the message to them was to understand, though, that white nationalists didn't originate, right? They didn't create anti-Semitism out of thin air in the United States, that they were merely tapping into bigotry that already existed and manifested itself across the political spectrum. I want to be clear, right? Anti-Semitism is not unique to the political right in this country. Well, I would argue that it is the political right that has tapped into it and organized it in a racialized form. We all know on this call, most of us understand in this country that anti-Semitism is still a threat. I want to say a couple of other points that I think were critical in this moment. I also want to make clear, right, that the way we address anti-Semitism is not merely addressing it at its fringes. And by way of counterexample, we don't address anti-Black racism in American society by merely focusing on anti-Black hate crimes. We understand that there are not only behaviors that occur, right, but that there are reinforcing systems, there are reinforcing attitudes that create an environment that allow the expression of anti-Semitism. And it is that environment that we must need to contend with. In short, we have to begin to understand, right, that anti-Semitism is a racialized form of bigotry that needs to be addressed. And to address it means recognizing it in the same way we recognize forms of racism that impact the African-American community or Latino community, Asian American communities, Native American communities. That does not mean we're conflating all the different forms of racism. Each community experiences a different type of racism, and it plays out in very different ways. But if we don't recognize first that there is anti-Semitism, how then are we beginning to understand how it plays out? I think that there are three specific narratives that play out in terms of anti-Semitism, and I'll end with this point and turn it back to you. There are three narratives. The first is the oldest racialized. It is the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, right? A forged fake document created in the late 1900s by Russian secret police in order to try to push back against the spread of democracy in Europe. It did so by positioning Jews, right, as an existential other, a global conspiracy that controlled politics, the economy, in order to destroy European Christendom. That has mainstreamed here in the United States in lots of different ways. Of course, in the white nationalist movement, you hear it around replacement theory. But again, as I said, not everything is just on the fringe. It mainstreams in lots of different ways. Accusations of Jews being capitalist or accusations of Jews being all socialist, right? These are different tropes that were presented in the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion that still influence how people think unconsciously in the society. The second narrative is one that was authored by a neo-Nazi by the name of William Pierce. He has passed. He was the head of an organization called the National Alliance. He wrote under a pseudonym, Andrew MacDonald, and wrote the book, The Turner Diary, that purports to tell a fictional story of a future white revolutionary movement in the United States, right, that overthrows the United States government, that it argues has been taken over by a Jewish conspiracy. It commits ethnic cleansing to create its white nationalist homeland. And the book ends with nuclear bombings of Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and in New York because of their large Jewish populations. It is that narrative that has driven the white nationalist movement and neo-Nazis in this country, right? It has driven many of the mass killings by extremists in this country, right? And to be clear, it is not just Jews who have been victims. Whether we are talking about the mass shootings that took place in Pittsburgh or in Poway, or whether we're talking about the targeting of Latinos in El Paso at a Walmart, or African-American worshipers in Charleston, South Carolina, all of those were driven by individuals who believed that they were in an existential war against Jews. That is why it is important for non-Jews to also tackle anti-Semitism. The last doesn't often appear as anti-Semitism. It's often framed as philo-Semitism. And that narrative is a book that was written in the 1970s by an author by the name of Hal Lindsey. It was a book called The Late Great Planet Earth. It has sold hundreds of millions of copies. It has been published in dozens of languages, and it is still a bestseller in this country and outside of this country. It purported to tell a retelling of Christian biblical text that argued, right, that in its view, right, that Armageddon, right, a nuclear war that centers Israel was crucial, right, to their triggering the return, the second coming of Christ within Christian liturgy. And that not only was there a nuclear war, but that there would then be the forced conversion or the conversions of Jews to Christianity. That narrative has driven a form of philo-Semitism in this country that often looks like it is sympathetic to the Jewish community here in the United States, right, and to Israel, but actually is another destructive form, right, of stereotypes and tropes that are placed on the Jewish community. Those are the three narratives that drive anti-Semitism in the United States. All of them drive conspiracy theories, often that lead to violence. And until the human rights and racial justice movement in this country, progressives and liberals, understand that anti-Semitism exists, that it is not just a behavior, but it is an ideology, we will be left defenseless to its impact, both on the lives of our communities and on the lives of democracy.
So thank you, Eric. And I'm really glad you mentioned the Turner Diaries. That was also a basis for the, according to prosecutors, I believe, for Timothy McVeigh, who was the Oklahoma City bomber. So it's actually a really important, it's a really important book that has inspired many, many people to commit a lot of acts of violence across the country. So I think it's probably a good point to bring in Orrin. And Eric, you may want to sort of add to this, but I want to give Orrin a moment here. So look, you know, Orrin, what's different about what's happening in the United States, you know, and across the world right now? I mean, even when we look at, you know, the stats, the ADL numbers, we see the last 4 or 5 years, historic numbers of anti-Semitism, but not just anti-Semitism, extremism in general, with more and more people being targeted, more and more violence. And, you know, I alluded to this earlier, but just in the last, 4 weeks, we had a rabbi in Boston who was stabbed, and with prosecutors bringing hate crime charges with, based upon a motive of anti-Semitism. And we also had a incident in Winthrop, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston, by a small community by the airport, where I'll just characterize him as a highly educated white man who had no otherwise public profile of any type of hatred, killed two African Americans, a former retired police officer, retired military officer, and a working theory that he may have actually been en route to a synagogue. A really bizarre kind of case, but he left behind 3 manifestos that I've actually seen, some of which contained anti-Semitism and racism. So Oren, give us some perspective on what's going on, and any insights into why we're seeing this, here and abroad right now.
Sure. So the first thing I want to say is maybe give a little bit more information on the data, right? And then say why. So Robert alluded to this in the beginning. We collect anti-Semitic incidents reported to us from the communities around the country for our audit of anti-Semitic incidents. We've been doing this since 1979. So there's like a 40-year record. And last year, 2020, this is a time of pandemic, was the 3rd highest year on record, over 2,000 incidents reported to ADL. This included vandalism, like graffiti at a synagogue. It included harassment, many of these in schools where people would put some Photoshop of a kid, even if they're not seeing them day to day, inside of an oven and put it on, Instagram, that type of thing. Not all these are crimes, but we still include those as incidents, but also assaults, right? And so it was the 3rd highest year on record, following the highest year on record the previous year. This speaks to a couple of things. One is perhaps more people are reporting because there's more concern, and that should be viewed as positive, right? The one thing that people sometimes feel that they can do is report an incident to feel like they're making a difference, but that does not account for the majority of the incidents that we're collecting. And so when you dig deeper into those incidents, what do we find? 16% are attributed to extremist movements or groups or those that support those narratives. So 16% is not insignificant, but that means 84% are average Joes and Janes, people who are not necessarily connected to an extremist movement. And to me, that speaks to the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism, how it's become more regular. It's not as taboo. And that's to your question, Robert, why? And why is that here? And I think this applies globally. Why is it no longer taboo to use the stereotypes that have been around for many years in sort of modern ways, whether it's Zoom bombing or online social content or harassment or assault? And I think this speaks to the fundamental undermining of democratic institutions, both in the United States and abroad. When you undermine democratic institutions, anti-Semitism and violence is not far behind. And it's true for other forms of bigotry as well. And then you add on that sort of the war against the truth. When truth is a little harder to get to, when truth has become something that's debatable, anti-Semitism is not far behind. And then finally, you actually have movements and platforms that actually benefit from the increase in the anti-Semitic narratives that we know animate people to action. So for example, QAnon, very much of an American phenomenon, built on sort of the conspiracies that are not too far afield from classic anti-Semitic conspiracies of control and media manipulation and sexual perversion and everything that QAnon stands for. Well, guess what? That has been exported from the United States to Germany and the UK and to Japan, right? And so when conspiracy theories are normalized outside of the United States, certainly in online platforms, it makes it more difficult for people to even recognize anti-Semitism when it arises. So Robert, as much as I'm concerned about the data that we're bringing in, the examples that you've mentioned, I'm often more concerned about the inability for people to even recognize what anti-Semitism is anymore. And secondarily, I'm concerned about the sometimes unwillingness for people to actually do something about it. So my last, point is on this. During the conflict that we just came out of between Israel and Gaza, not only did we see an increase in anti-Semitic incidents on the ground here and the UK, and there's statistics from around the globe about how that animates anti-Semitic animus and how that impacts on the ground. But, we saw on Twitter, for example, 17,000 tweets immediately after the conflict began that said Hitler was right? It's not even trying to negotiate someone's concern about Zionism with Judaism. It was just like flat out, Hitler was right. We saw on 8chan, this sort of cesspool that has led to many of the attacks that Erik mentioned. Anti-Semitic narratives there increased 380%. And I know you know this, Robert, we got a lot of community concerns expressed to us about how kids were learning about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for the first time on TikTok, in which anti-Semitism was the way in which they were sort of being introduced to that concept. So what has changed? It's not just undermining our democratic institutions. It's not just public officials giving voice to that. It's the fact that the very place that we spend most of our time, at least I do, on my phone, has become a place in which access to anti-Semitism is more easily available, where organizing around anti-Semitic themes has become part of the mechanism in which drives opportunity for these technologies to get money, to support themselves, and which has made anti-Semitism just harder for an average person to recognize. And that's why I look forward to the solutions part of this conversation.
I think the solutions are going to be tough. I was sort of struck by your comment, Oren, about not enough people actually know what anti-Semitism is and how to actually recognize it. And I think that's one of the challenges that, like, everyone on this call, I'm speaking like, Shira, Erik, Oren, and I would include sort of other Jewish institutions. This is a big one of how do we overcome this, because the technology is moving so fast. But Shira, like, maybe I know that there's been a lot of discussion just about what role the Israeli government or Israeli society might have. And so, like, I'm thinking, is there some role here, just to Oren's point about not enough people know? Who's, what's your sense on, like, is there a role for the Israeli government to, I know, even establish some kind of task force? I know there's the Global Forum on Anti-Semitism, but, as the government of the home of the state home of the Jewish people, should they have a bigger role in helping to, do this education? And then I'm sort of, I'll turn it over to you, but I'm actually interested also, Erik, as sort of a, lifelong, focus also on education, what thoughts you might have on this. So Shira first.
I think that what Erik and Oren said is just spot on, and it's hard to answer your question without to acknowledge for a moment the fact that we all, as professionals, as activists, I think, have to separate the Israeli conflict with Gaza from the anti-Semitism conversation. It is a must. And I think that we all have to find ways to educate young adults through technology or through school, through synagogues, churches, about anti-Semitism, and not allow to connect it to conflict on the ground. And I want to say why, for those that are listening. First of all, anti-Semitism is something that goes, as you heard from experts like Erik and Oren, many, many years ago. It's centuries. It's not a conflict that started 70 or 80 years ago. That is a political conflict. It's not a race conversation. It's not ethnic conversation. It's a political conflict that's happening. And the fact that many young adults, the second the conflict happened in Israel, which is not something that even Israel initiated, but as you said, facts and truth is not something a young generation is seeking for. It's becoming a conversation about anti-Semitism and the right for Jews to exist. This is not something acceptable. The second thing I want to say, We have to maybe use our common impact to force the platforms to seek, not just around anti-Semitism, to seek for facts and for truth, to not combine engagement of populations with, as you said, the power to use it against societies or communities. And I think this blend is confusing for the young generation. Everything is all one, and it's not all one. To be against a race or against a faith, it's not like taking a stand or even a critical stand. It is okay that people can criticize Israel about actions, but it has nothing to do with the fact that we cannot feel comfortable or safe here in Brighton or comfortable in Cambridge just because Israel is in a conflict. It has nothing to do with that. The second thing I want to point, we also have to acknowledge the fact that the contribution of the state of Israel and the Jewish community around the world to worldwide issues is tremendous. And we need to use it to our benefit. We should not be shy about it. We are very quiet because we are so worried to, make these dragons come out of the, the genie out of the bottle. Because if we're going to speak about that, it's going to make, or again, Jews are taking power. You know what? We should not be shy. We're contributing to eliminate conflicts in the world, to have a better life quality, to have technologies accessible to all people. This is something that we should maybe think how to bring it part of our messages to the younger generation, because younger generation is proud about solutions and very comfortable when they feel belong around global issues. And anti-Semitism should be a global issue. Part of the conversation in social justice and human rights should be that anti-Semitism is not something for negotiations. It's something that it's non-negotiable and not acceptable. To your question, yes, absolutely. I think the state of Israel, together with the Jewish community around the world and together with world leaders around social justice, should come together, if it's a task force or a forum, if it's a global that knows to operate in the global platforms. I have no doubt that I think that the Israeli government should raise its involvement around this issue, because one of the things that will happen, I think, as a result of raising involvement, it will no longer become a community matter and an individual matter. It will become a global issue, because once a country takes it on, it's not the same as a nonprofit or us, all of us, as leaders, experts, or even activists on the ground. We will change the approach around this once, a president and prime ministers putting this in the center. I have to add maybe something that we don't want to say, but anti-Semitism is not good also for business, and the businesses should be aware of it. The comment that Ben and Jerry's, for example, said this week, which is not around anti-Semitism, it's around political statement, but it has a great impact on Jewish outside of Israel and Jews in different communities. So it's hard to separate at times these issues, but we have to say it's not good for democracy. It's not good for flourishing businesses. It's not good for any community and sector that look upon themselves, from ethical and moral values. And if it's okay with you, Robert, I'll add one more thing to say that one, as I said before, we should no longer connect Israeli conflict with the Palestinians as part of the anti-Semitism. We should see anti-Semitism as an issue that is from the hard right and hard left together, combined. So it's not about a political, as Eric said, it's ideology that people should not feel comfortable holding and sharing. And the other thing I would say is that we also allow ourselves, as Oren said, people do not know to recognize already what's anti-Semitic, because it's a joke, it's a comment, it's just a local incident. We also do not know the limits of free speech. Or I should maybe phrase it differently, probably would be better to say, if we all believe and support free speech as the flourishing democracies, we should be equal in our reactions to inequality when it comes to freedom of speech, and reaction to when we see incidents. Because when we see incidents from Jews, we do not react, or the state of Israel, we do not react the same when we see incidents from Palestinians or other minorities when we criticize them on the newspaper like New York Times or news or media platforms. So if we believe that voices should be vocal, we should have the same standard to how we criticize them, how we speak against them, how we give punishments and rewards.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Shira. A lot of good points there. Eric, I just want to know if you want to jump in on this, feel free. Otherwise, we can move on.
I'll just quickly point out, I think, a couple of pieces that are crucial here. The first is we should understand, while there is a lot of work to do, there is a lot of work. Here in the United States, we have to acknowledge that we are a country that has not had serious conversations around anti-Semitism as an ideology for a very long time. This is something that is decades in the building that we are now experiencing as Jews and non-Jews in this country. It will not be solved in a year. It will not be solved in 2 or 3 years, but it can be solved here, and it can be solved outside the United States. The one thing I would say, just to reinforce what Oren said previously, what happens, how this conversation plays out in the United States has real global repercussions. We understand that from the events at Christchurch in New Zealand, right? Germany, other points around the world. But I do want to say really briefly that I hope people understand that what is unique in this moment to me is that in my decades of doing education around anti-Semitism, working with different communities to respond to anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry, I have never witnessed, right? And I'm going to say this again, I have never witnessed the level of what I am calling intercommunal violence, right? That largely targeted, right, disproportionately the Jewish community that I witnessed over these last 2 months in the United States. This is not to take away from the physical assaults and attacks and killings targeting the Orthodox Jewish community, the Haredi community. What I'm saying is that we saw something new in the United States, something I have only, right, understood in places like France, Germany, or other countries. This question of intercommunal violence, right, is one that we need to take seriously here in the United States, right? And we need to be engaged with folks outside of the United States who have struggled with this issue as well. I think it is not going away, and we need to understand its implications. There are also opportunities to that, right? We have watched other types of intercommunal violence as well between other communities. So I want to flag that piece of it. The other, right, is to understand that people understanding what the basic tropes are of anti-Semitism does equip them, right, to navigate the terrain of anti-Semitism in our society. Understanding the religious tropes, right? Jews being accused for the murder of Jesus, right? Host desecration, ritual murder, blood libel, or the economic and political tropes around controlling the media, controlling the world financial system. When we understand those tropes, we are more likely to recognize them when they are being used, right, as dog whistles here in the United States or outside the United States. And so we need to quadruple down, right? All of our organizations need to figure out how we can continue to do sustained education, right, in this country and outside this country around what the tropes are. Often I come across organizations, particularly where I reside in the progressive liberal sphere of politics, who have no idea, are totally shocked when I unpack some of the tropes that they sometimes use without even intending to. So there is big space here. There's lots of work to be done. It's not going to be done overnight, but there is, education is important, but also understanding some of the new trends of anti-Semitism in the United States.
I'm glad you touched on this point, Eric, particularly around progressive spaces. And I'm just sort of reflecting back to Shira, like a few moments ago, when Shira, you sort of mentioned anti-Semitism from both the right and the left. And I'm seeing a number of questions in the chat about anti-Semitism from the left and also from the right. And I think we would all agree that like they're all a one threat or another to Jews and, you know, bigger communities. So I'm wondering if maybe anyone wants to sort of comment on this. And maybe I'll just sort of start with, I'd actually like to give everybody an opportunity to sort of touch on this aspect of it. But I'm going to sort of maybe turn to Oren first, because when I think about, you know, this individual who, you know, planned an attack in Winthrop, Massachusetts, he ended up being killed by police. And even this other man who is now in custody, an Egyptian national who stabbed the rabbi in Boston. A lot of these, you know, are sort of, you know, they could be, you know, lone wolf extremists, maybe inspired in one way or another. But I know that the threats are coming from, you know, from different directions. Like, where should we be most focused? Do we need to be worried more about one group or another, or is it all like, what's your sense? Because you're monitoring extremists from a high level.
Yeah. I mean, I say this sort of respectfully, right? I think these are important conversations. I sort of reject the question. We need to worry about anti-Semitism, full stop, right? We know that violent anti-Semitism, for example, both in the US and abroad, has been carried out by those who subscribe to sort of extreme right or extreme left or Islamist. We don't have a luxury, frankly, to ignore anti-Semitism and violent anti-Semitism from any part of the political spectrum. And so it's not a choice that we have to make. We need to combat anti-Semitism. And by doing that, I think we get to a place where hopefully we minimize this. And remember, I'm going to harken back to the statistic that I gave. 84% of the anti-Semitic incidents last year that were reported to us, we can't describe sort of a political motivation. Are they left? Are they right? I don't think it matters. It really, at the end of the day, here's the only reason why it does matter, is that when we're looking for people to call that out, Eric was just talking about sort of explaining these tropes in the progressive circles that he's operating in. I would argue that the only way that matters is when we're looking to find a solution, because it's really, really important for somebody who identifies as, say, on the right of the political spectrum to speak out against anti-Semitism on the right of the political spectrum, and somebody who's on the left to make sure that they're speaking out about anti-Semitism on the left. We tend to speak out against the anti-Semitism of the other more than we speak about the anti-Semitism sort of within that is a little closer to us. But think about it. Where can we impact more change than with the people we already have relationships with, people who already trust us, people whose messages might already resonate easier because it's less viewed as an attack because already so much common cause has been made. So we need to stop looking at anti-Semitism as a left-wing issue, as a right-wing issue. We need to look at anti-Semitism as an issue, period, because for years, anti-Semitism has showed that it could be used and exploited and weaponized no matter where you are on the political spectrum. And it's up to us to speak out inside and hoping that the broader community taps down on anti-Semitism writ large.
Shira, Eric, do you want to jump in here?
I would say that it's important for us to understand a couple of things, right? It is important at the end of the day to continue to tell ourselves, like a mantra, right? Hate groups do not bring anti-Semitism into our communities. They merely organize the anti-Semitism that already exists. And we have to keep telling ourselves that every day. Oren knows me well. I often say there is no left or right-wing anti-Semitism. There is merely anti-Semitism and how people choose to tap into it to organize political power in our societies. And that is what we have to push back to. The way I would relate it is to the events of 9/11. If I remember the morning of September 11th, I was living in Seattle, working for a group that did work to counter hate crimes in the region. By the time I had got into my office, right, 30 minutes, right, after finding out, I received 2 phone calls, right? The first was to inform me that someone had taken a banner, taken a sheet and spray painted on it, death to the Palestinians, and hung it over the West Seattle Bridge, right? The second call that came in not long after was to tell me that someone had stuffed a stick of dynamite under the gas line, right, of a synagogue in Tacoma, Washington, right? We then witnessed a wave of hate crimes over the next week, right, that targeted Sikhs, those who were perceived to be Muslim, including Latinos, and others were targeted with physical violence, and at least 3 individuals who were Sikh were killed. Right? Hate crimes were on the rise across the country, and they're rising. And then there's a moment where the numbers just drop off. And I believe there's a correlation to that moment where the numbers dropped off. And where it dropped off was when George W. Bush and John Ashcroft went on television and said that hate crimes would not be tolerated in this country, right? And we have to understand, we have to do a better job of holding public figures accountable, right, around anti-Semitism. We have to ensure that people are speaking out because we have to set the tone for the moment. So setting the tone is critically important. The next piece I would just say really quickly in terms of dealing with anti-Semitism across the political spectrum is that we have to do a better job of understanding, right, the difference between unintentional anti-Semitism, right, that comes from just not understanding the issue, right, and then those who deliberately tap into anti-Semitism in order to try to build hysteria, right, or mass movements. In short, we can't treat everyone as if they are Louis Farrakhan or David Duke, right, when they stumble through anti-Semitism. But neither can we ignore it. So we have to do a better job of finding a balance between constructive engagement around this issue, allowing people to build their memory muscles. As someone who's done anti-racist organizing and education for 3 decades, right, I have a message to the Jewish community on this, that if you perceive the way we did within the racial justice movement, right, basically shutting down everyone, right, who could not get it right or figure it out the gate, right, what you're going to do, what we are going to do, right, is we're going to make people afraid to talk about the issue because they might get it wrong. And if we create that type of environment, we are not helping our leaders build the memory muscles that they need to navigate one of the oldest forms of racism and conspiracies, right, in this world, which is anti-Semitism. So that's the way we have to approach it. But neither is this an argument in any way that we can afford to ignore anti-Semitism any longer, not here in the United States and not outside the United States. In short, anti-Semitism is killing all of us, Jews and non-Jews. It is also destroying democracy, right? The only system, right, that has been created in this world that has shown to be able to expand an evolving vision of inclusion and rights.
Eric, I'm going to give you the last word in 1 sec because we're almost at the top of the hour. But I do want to ask Eric one question that sort of a couple people actually put in the chat, which is when you point out the tropes and like you're actually, you know, actually engaged in doing what you're describing to us, like are people receptive? Like I think like what you're doing is probably something that like we need an army of people doing.
Yes.
So can you just give us like a little insight into like what happens when you engage in some of these conversations? And then I'm going to turn it to Shira to hopefully close us out close to the top of the hour.
It's why I hang out with Oren and others. There is an army, right? We're not a large army yet, but there is an army of individuals, Jews and non-Jews, who understand the critical nature of the struggle against anti-Semitism. Look, the responses are the same responses one might imagine. If I tell folks, right, that when I cross the paths of law enforcement, right, I am deeply terrified. And I understand the odds of me being physically harmed, right, increase when there is law enforcement in my environment, right? If you are not African-American, right, that may be hard to accept. You may push back against that. You may even be a law enforcement officer or a former law enforcement officer, and you feel affront, right? That's not said to demonize law enforcement. It is merely an understanding of how my environment works. Some people sit and listen courageously. Some people push back. Some people push back because they're trying to learn more. It is the same with anti-Semitic tropes, right? Upon first hearing them, I remember working with an organization that does economic justice work. And I was talking to them and walking through tropes, and I was using the one of the octopus. I was just showing, you know, the political trope, right? The idea of Jews controlling the world, the global conspiracy. Everyone knows this image. And the head of this very large economic justice group says, we use that imagery all the time. We had no idea that was its origins, and that's how it's largely used. Now, that group could have gotten defensive, right? And they probably put a lot of work into that imagery and into their materials and decided, look, we're not gonna touch that. But going through a process of discussion, right? I wasn't beating up on them. I was just saying, I want you to understand these different tropes because they come into play a lot around discussions of economic equity in this country. Well, I want to tell you, this large organization put together a working group, right? A progressive organization, and they decided to review all of their materials to ensure that when they talk about economic equity, right, that they are not unconsciously or unintentionally promoting anti-Semitism. That was from deep engagement, right? But I have to tell you, right, when people understand this, particularly within the human rights frame, right, most folks working in the human rights movement don't wake up in the morning, right, with the goal of spreading bigotry. And so that work is easier, but look, it has to be broader. Our entire country, right, our entire world right now needs to understand that anti-Semitism is being manipulated, right, and being used, right, in order to weaken our participation in governance.
Thank you. Shira, I'm gonna give you, we're almost at the top of the hour.
Sure.
A couple minutes to help wrap up the discussion.
Of course. I would say two things. Number one, regarding your question, does it make a difference if it's from the right or the left? I could not agree more with both of my colleagues to say it makes no difference whatsoever. The only thing that we can use by identify, to my knowledge, identify if it's coming from right or left, it's actually the argument that can be presented, because we process things through the ideologies and values that we understand better. So if it's from a religious perspective, you can educate your team and experts to use the right data in order to convey a message. And if from more lefty, so it's a liberal conversation and so. But from where it's coming to the point, what's its impact, it makes no difference. It's just the argument and the conversation we can have. I want to end by saying a couple solutions, and not solutions that maybe we do not know, and it's probably nothing that we did not hear before, but sometimes to emphasize what we need to do better, it's part of the solution. First, we need to work closer, better, all of us, because the numbers speak. To have, as Arik said, larger army of people makes a difference. The number is important. So I want to call everyone and anyone that comes across this issue. If you do a small action or a bigger action, it doesn't matter. You need to join. You have to speak up, because speaking up, it's a form of participation, as you said, and we should not allow ourselves to be quiet. I want to remind ourselves that the more people that gather around justice issues, like in the recent few years, and definitely this year, Black Lives Matters and the Latin American and Asian, were not presented just by African American. Everyone got together around it. Asian hate, Latin hate, everyone. I want to see more people from the Jewish community and the non-Jewish community alike speaking against anti-Semitism in their own communities, their own businesses, their own faith-based congregation. And so this is number one, is speak up. Let's work better together, because numbers speak, scale speak. Let's use technology and their platforms, not just individually, like from a business perspective, get together, make the platforms have and stand up for more values, for more justice. And the last sentence I'll say, justice does not mean to me just a fight in the court by lawyers. Justice means taking small action. When you see someone being hurt, protect them, speak up. Justice means that when you hear something wrong, you're not afraid to be fired, because today, our horns protect us. If you're going to speak up and you're going to be fired, or if you are not invited to a group in your college, or you have people to support you, and we here and many more are part of the group to support you. So I want to say justice is not just a phrase, it's a form of action. So please do. Let's get together, because impact and scale matters in these issues. Okay, we cannot fight it or win in these battles alone. And I want to say that this type of conversations are opportunities to be, to strengthen our own muscles, to feel not alone, to come together, to even gain some knowledge and practices. So I want to thank you all for this opportunity, because I think it's just the beginning.
So thank you, Shira. First, I just want to thank our panelists, because all of you, to Shira's point, are actually engaged in justice in one way or another. And I think one of the messages for me coming out of this conversation is we need to build that army. And anti-Semitism is a threat. It doesn't matter what, regardless of the source. And so if we want to counter this threat, all of us are going to have to take on some responsibility and some real action. So I want to thank Eric Ward, Shira Rudderman, and my colleague Oren Siegel for their insights today. I also want to thank Nora Cohen, Max Miller, and Peggy Schuker on the ADL team, Liat from the Rudderman Foundation. And we also had a team of people working behind the scenes to make sure that everything was accessible for everyone, regardless of Hebrew or English. And regardless from which country or which continent you participated or which time zone, let's all get to work and be engaged in that justice, that just action in combating all forms of anti-Semitism. I look forward, my hope leaving this is that we reconvene this panel in person sometime in the next, probably 6 to 12 months, and we can really be engaged in an in-person discussion and maybe start doing some workshops on how we can get on the ground and take this to the next level. Thank you all very much. Enjoy your morning, afternoon, or evening.
Thank you.